Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the EBD Seminar Series. I am María José Ruiz, one of the co-organizers. I'm going to introduce our speaker today, and afterwards, Irene Mendoza will moderate the questions. Before I introduce our speaker, just a couple of housekeeping reminders. If you need a certificate of attendance, please write your name in the chat and then send an email to seminarios@ebd.csIC.es. If you want to make questions to the speaker, you can write them down in the chat as well. So our speaker today, he is from the house, Nacho Bartumeos. He's a researcher here at the Doñana Biological Station. And he did his PhD at the CRIAF and University Autónoma of Barcelona. And then he did a postdoc in the United States and Sweden. He is currently a Ramón y Cajal Fellowship, but he's going to be a scientific researcher later here as well at EBD. He is broadly interested in understanding how global change drivers impact community structure and composition, and how those impacts translate to the ecosystem functioning. And he focuses mainly on plant-pollinator communities. Without further ado, Nacho, when you're ready, welcome to EBD Seminars.
Thank you very much for the presentation and for the invitation. I'm really happy to share some of the research we are doing. And usually when I do this kind of talks that are more for a general public, I like to talk about how beautiful pollinators are. But I realized that I already gave a talk for EBD 2 years ago with this topic. So today I'm going to try to do something a bit more different. So usually in this kind of talks, I want to emphasize that we have a huge diversity of bee species, so more than 1,000 bee species only in Spain. This is for context like the double of species as the number of birds. And I also have some usually results showing the importance of bees, like why bees matter for ecosystem functioning, and they are really important for the pollination of most of the flowering plants and also of our crops, especially the more tasty ones, the fruits and vegetables. Most of my previous research has been dealing with this kind of approaches, where I try to understand how different community ecology descriptors, let's say the abundance of some species or the functional diversity or even some network structure is changing with different global change drivers. It can be habitat loss or climate change. And this is giving us quite nice insights of how these relationships look like. But as I read somewhere that I don't remember the source right now, like ecologists, we are on the risk of becoming simple accountants of the destruction of biodiversity on Earth. And while I think it's still important to do this work on understanding how the communities change with different global change drivers, I'm becoming more and more interested in being able to predict those changes. And the first step to predict how ecological communities, in this case of plants and pollinators, but it can be any community, is to understand the mechanisms regulating the stability and persistence of those communities. We need to go deeper into the ecological theory. And this is what I've been doing in the last 5 years or so. I've been getting more and more interested in having a more strong theoretical basis of how these communities work, always from an empirical point of view. It's, I think one of the stumbling blocks of ecology right now is that a lot of times empiricists and theoreticians speak different languages, and it's hard to integrate the knowledge, and both are needed, and we need to strengthen these collaborations. So overarching question that I want to ask today is like, what mechanisms allow species to persist in a community? And hopefully this will also help us understand, if we understand these mechanisms, to anticipate to some of the effects of global change. To answer this question, I'll make a step back and show you this picture. In this picture, there is, this is not a typewriter. So this contains each and every piece needed to build a typewriter. But if they are not assembled correctly, if they don't interact each piece with each other in a correct way, they are useless. And the same happens with ecological communities. This is not an ecological community. This is just a bunch of species. We need to understand how these species are interacting among each other to understand why these species can persist and how the system can function. This is a very nice study that using direct and indirect interactions among all these organisms, we can see how species of fish can have an effect on the pollination of a flowering plant, which, if we don't track all these interactions, would be a priori something that we would discard, like, oh yes, fishes and plants won't have any effect. So the overarching framework of how I plan to understand better how communities persist, it's rooted on this network of interactions. And we have a very solid theory on interactions driving community persistence. And here I bring in my friend, Oscar Godoy. We met with Oscar in the United States. We were both postdocs there in different coasts. So no much connection in terms of daily interactions, but we were meeting in different ESAs, Ecological Society of America meetings, where we were discussing some of the models that Oscar was using to understand modern coexistence. And those are beautiful models, theoretically rooted in very solid grounds that describe how plant-plant interactions drive plant coexistence. And I was kind of teasing him like, okay, that's very nice, but you're only considering plants, and what are the pollinators? So we were planning that someday we will do something integrating both fields. So most of the things I will present now are the work of both Oscar and myself. And one of the main conclusions that we arrive is that ecologists, we are often as the blind men in this tale from ancient India, where a king told a bunch of blind men to touch an elephant and describe it. And some of them said, oh, it's a wall, or it's a spear, or it's a tree, depending on which part they are seeing or touching in this case. But if you don't have the full picture, it's hard to understand the concept of an elephant in this case. And I think ecologists, we tend to do the same. So I'm the first guilty. I focus on plant-pollinator interactions, and then nothing else matters for me. And this approach it's very relevant to break the problem in smaller pieces. But at the same time, at some point, we need to put the pieces together. So we're going to try to bring different kinds of interactions together to understand community ecology. But to do so, we're going to start from the beginning. And as I said, we have a very solid theory on how plants coexist. So when someone sees this landscape, it says, oh, those are a bunch of plants competing for nutrients, space, sunshine. And this competition probably is regulating this community. And Peter Chesson mathematically framed this coexistence theory, and it's very elegant because it summarizes in two different axes why species coexist in a region. So the first axis is the most obvious one, which is it's called fitness difference. And basically, this is the principle that the most efficient species, the most competitive species, will end up excluding the less competitive species. So as the original examples of competitive exclusion done by Gauss in the 30s, putting different parameters in the same pot and seeing which one wins, we can expect that the more competitive species exclude the other. But the most interesting thing of this theory is that there's a second axis of variation, which are the niche differences. So we can avoid this exclusion if we differentiate somehow in niche. And there are a lot of typical examples, but for example, plants may avoid competition by water by having shallow roots or very deep roots. So they do not compete for the same resources, and they can then both coexist. And the idea is that the stronger are your fitness differences, the more in balance is this competition between the both species, the larger has to be the niche differences to compensate. And this theory is very nice because you only need to know the fitness of the species, like the reproductive success, like how good I am at reproducing, and the competition matrix, that is how each species competes with each other. So if the competition is very low, it means they share less niche, and if the competition is really high, they probably overlap a lot in niche. And as I said, this theory is not only very nicely formulated verbally, but also it has a mathematical formulation which we can track visually. And for me, an important thing here is to track in this graph how the reproductive success, in this case, for example, of a plant, is a function of their growth rate, which we can see here in the y-axis, like how many seeds do I reproduce in optimal conditions. And it's also a function of the competition with other species, or even with the same species. And this alpha parameter gives us the shape of this curve, and the higher is the competition, the stronger is the decrease in seed set in these shapes. So far so good. We have this solid theory, and then we want to add more stuff into it. Like, okay, we know that pollinators are present and pollinators are important, and we know we are ignoring these pollinators. So can we do something about that? We know that pollinators are important for seed set. So pollination is necessary for most of the plants. And we also have theoretical expectations that the structure of these interactions impact the stability of the community. Although this is a different kind of work, we have good expectations to it. It makes sense to consider pollinators. So let's try if we can have the competitive interactions between plants and overlay onto these competitive interactions the pollinator mutualistic interactions, which are beneficial for the plants. So that's where we start. We came to this beautiful finca in Doñana National Park. It's Finca Caracoles. It's an annual grassland. It's an hypersaline grassland, so the species coexist here by also being good competitors in saline or allophyte plants. And we want to see if we integrate pollination and competition. But back then we had no funding, but we have a secret weak point, which is Jose Lanuza, who was a master's student, and he was interested in doing that. And he did a lot of the work that I will present right now. So to summarize, we're still in this framework where we try to understand coexistence in one single trophic level, the plants level, but we want to incorporate the effects of other trophic levels. How we did that? So we were like adding complexity to the maths. And the exact shape of the equation is not important, but the important thing for me is that we can modulate the growth rates will depend on the environment and on the mutualistic effects. So if you have pollinators, you will have higher growth rates than if you don't. So we can add this effect. And as you can see, the lambdas from with and without pollinators change a lot in terms of the seed set that you can produce in optimal conditions. The same way, the competition effects is also modulated by environment, by mutualistic effects, and also the competition alphas are changing. And this, now it sounds quite straightforward, but it took us a while to parameterize these models. And that was very nice because we can go back to this Chessonian framework where we can assess the fitness differences and the niche differences. And each of these dots represents a pairwise interaction between two plants. And the dots that are in the blue area are these pairwise interactions, these pairs of species that can coexist. And the blue dots in the red area are pairs of species that are predicted not to coexist by theory. So one species will exclude the other. This is without pollinators. Let's see what happens when we add the pollinators. What we see is that pollinators change the way the species interrelates, and especially they change the fitness differences. So they tend to equalize the fitness of different plant species. And this is really cool. And in fact, it makes sense in the light of the life history theory, because species investing a lot in flowers with nectar and pollen being showy, maybe they are less competitive. But when they get the benefit of the pollinators, they maximize their seed set. While other species, like for example, grasses, they do not depend on pollinators. So adding pollinators do not increase their seed set, but without pollinators, they are still being very competitive. So pollinators can help mitigating this fitness difference, which increase coexistence. To some degree, they also reduce a bit niche differences, but this effect is less clear. Okay, I wanted to get this chance also to have a quick note on this kind of mathematical theory that is behind this, which I'm not explaining in detail, but I hope at least to give a conceptual overview of how this works. And math doesn't come easy to me, so at least this is what I thought. So I spent quite a lot of time understanding it conceptually, and at some point I needed to just sit down and take the equations and code them in R, because this is something I understand, and then I can play with the numbers and see how they work, see how the shape of the curves change, and that was really useful. So don't expect this kind of maths or theory to come easy, but also do not refuse to look at these more complex models, because most of the times you just need time and someone guiding you through it. So I think that was a really good exercise for me to really understand. On the other hand, I really did a mess with all these equations in R. So at some point we needed someone to really make this really useful for the wider community. And we finally get some funding, and we can hire David Garcia Callejas, and he did an amazing job rewriting from scratch all these functions. So if you are interested in this kind of toolbox, they are now published, and more or less, I would say, fairly easy to implement. What else can we do with this kind of practices? We can also ask things about what controls pollinator populations. Up to now, the classical view is that the resources, so the plant species, are driving pollinator responses. So there are a lot of emphasis on plant pollinator networks. But those are way more complex. We have these arrows between the pollinators. Those are competition among them, which is usually ignored. And we have also a series of predators, parasites, pathogens that also affecting pollinators. In fact, parasitism rate in pollinators, in bees specifically, is really high. But we don't know which, like if a top-down regulation or is a bottom-up regulation. And we can ask with this kind of models, which is the driving force. In fact, we are working on that. We have no data yet, but we are using these nests where different species of bees use. We located 50 of those nests across a gradient of floral resources. And then we can track both the fitness, so the number of offspring that each female does. And this is very nice because we have one of the components that we need to fit on these equations. And we also can relate to the competition with other bees in the same location. So we have the competitive effects. As the nests can be open and examined, we can get the parasitism rates. So we can see how parasitism changed these relationships. And we can have also the resources. So we can try to parameterize the effect of parasitism, resources, and competition onto bee coexistence. I can show you any results on that because we are still counting and opening these gains. But I wanted to give a flavor of what kind of things we can do with this kind of models. Okay, this is the first part of the talk. And right now we were quite happy on expanding this coexistence theory to allow effects of other trophic levels. But we're still in this single domain, like we're still assessing coexistence across one trophic level. While we know that coexistence should be important not only for plants, but for plants and pollinators simultaneously. We want communities that all the plants and all the pollinators can survive, not only look at one side of the equation. And there is a huge body of literature, as I was pointing out before, looking specifically at this relationship across trophic levels. So network theories make a lot of emphasis on these interactions on like predation or mutualistic interactions across trophic levels, but they usually ignore the interactions within trophic level. So one challenge that we had with this project is, can we integrate both? As I said, we got some funding. So we were starting to collaborate with two theoretical researchers, Rudolf Rohr and Sergei Saavedra. Here is Rudolf showing us some maths. And we started to see how can we implement both within and across trophic level interactions simultaneously to assess the full community. And both Rudolf and Sergei, they've been developing a theory which is rooted on structural stability. And I won't go in detail on how this is calculated, but this is a graphical or a geometrical approach. So we can see how different configurations of networks create a domain of feasibility. What that means. So what we ask is, given this configuration of interactions, what are the chances that all the species can persist? And then instead of having a single value, we have these feasibility domains, which tell us the bigger the feasibility domain, the more likely is that all species can survive within this space. When the feasibility domain is really narrow, it means that any small perturbation will likely make one of the species to go extinct. I'm drawing these feasibility domains here as triangles because they have as dimensions as number of species we have in the community, and plotting a 6, 7, 10 dimension space, it's something beyond the human abilities. But the idea is quite simple. From this full space, We have in red the feasibility domain that this particular configuration of interactions provides. And we can compare then the growth rates if they of the different species, if they fit inside this domain. If they fit inside, it means that the structure is stable. It means that all species can survive. If it goes outside, then it means that some species at least will go extinct. And this is very nice because it maps really well with the framework from Peter Chesson, where the growth rates relate to how much do you reproduce and relates to these fitness differences. And the feasibility domain is constructed using this matrix of interactions that now can be competitive or mutualistic, but at the end is how the constraints imposed by the network fits the growth rates of the different species. We have here 3 examples, and we can see the first one is the one I described. In panel B, we can see how the feasibility domain is narrower. So in this kind of configuration, we have less room to fit the species, but still the community is feasible because this dot fits inside the feasibility domain. And we have the other extreme. We can have pretty large feasibility domains, like the opportunities to coexist are quite large, but still there may be some species with special requirements that are not able to survive, and hence the dot falls outside this feasibility domain. Okay, we have some nice theory now, but now we need to put it to test, because as I was saying, I think most of the problems that we are facing now are approached from theoretical point of view and from an empirical point of view, but we really integrate these 2 sections. And we decided to test this experimentally, and we decided to do that by assembling the simplest plant-pollinator network possible. This is a 3x3 network, like 3 species of pollinators, 3 species of plants, and it's designed so that they interact more or less in a nested way. So bumblebees can visit all these 3 flowers, but mason bees cannot visit tomato, for example, because that requires bus pollination, which it means that they grab the tomato and they sonicate it, and not all the species can do that. And the green bottleflies can visit only radish because, as I said, they cannot visit tomato, and they are also not heavy enough to open the field bean flower, so they do not visit field beans. So by choosing these species, we can create a realistic network where we can measure all these interaction parameters of interest, both the mutualistic effects, here is the gamma, the competitive effects among plants and among pollinators, here the 2 alphas, and also the growth rate or the reproduction success of each of the components. So in that case, the size of the circle is precisely this reproductive success. The more successful you are, the larger is the circle. That was a huge work, and basically we started by planting 1,000 replicates of plant competition pots. So in different pots, we have different competition regimes where we can measure how the reproductive success of different plants change depending on their neighbors. Those are all the different pods already grown, now without flowers yet. And we built these 17 cages where we can impose onto this plant competition experiment the different pollinator treatments. So once the flowers start to flower, we put a mesh onto these cages to prevent any entrance or exit of other pollinators, and create different treatments, which basically are combinations of these different pollinators. So some cages have only bumblebees, others have only mason bees, others has a combination of pairwise combination of different ones. So overall, we can estimate the mutualistic and competitive effects of all species with all other species. And this is something that we can do in a very simple experiment, but still is quite a lot of work to parameterize all these parameters. Okay, so we succeed. I have to say it took us 2 years to get it right, because first we need to learn the system, and second we need to really nail it. But we achieved to have these interaction matrices that take into account both the mutualistic effects and the competitive effects of each of the pollinators and plants. And we did that by measuring the reproductive success both of pollinators and plants in the different treatments. So we compare a first treatment without pollinators, a second treatment with this nested structure, and a third treatment where we prevented the interaction between bumblebees and radishes, just to see how perturbing the structure of the network has cascading effects on the probability of coexistence or persistence in this case of the different species. Okay, I'm gonna show first the results only taking into account the plants. So we're still answering the same question as before, like, can these three plants coexist? And for that, we can check these three different situations, like, can these three plants coexist when there is no pollinators? And we can see in this picture the network of competitive interactions on the three plants. The size of the circle, as I said, is proportional to the reproductive success, and the thickness of the lines are proportional to the competitive effect. So we can see that without pollinators, tomato is having a larger reproductive success than the other two plants. And we can see that not only the reproductive success change with pollinators, but also the strength of the competitive relationships between them changes. This is the raw material that we need. How this translates into these feasibility domains that we were explaining before. What we can see is that the feasibility domain without pollinators is very narrow. And indeed, in our experimental community, the plants are not predicted to persist under these circumstances. So their growth rates are not accommodated within this interaction structure. However, when we include pollinators, this feasibility domain expands, especially under one of those configurations, and we have more likelihood of the plant species persisting, especially into the modified configuration where we can see that the orange dot fits inside the feasibility domain. That was pretty cool, and we put that theory to test, and we can also have a first take-home message that pollinators are important for increasing the coexistence probability of plants. But as I said, we want to answer a larger, like a more overarching question. It's like, can all the 6 species coexist simultaneously? So we can compare, in that case, the nested structure with the one with the link physically prevented. First of all, I'm not going to show any feasibility domain graph, because with 6 species, as I said, it's a 6-dimensional space, which makes no much sense. But also because the probability of coexistence of the 6 species is very similar between the two structures, is around 25% of probability. So the feasibility domains are really similar. But if we go a bit deeper and we assess the persistence probability of each of the different species, we can see, if we look at the blue dots first, that different species have different probabilities of persistence. So tomato is clearly a winner. It will most likely persist under the nested structure, and some species are having a harder time. If we compare that to the link physically prevented in orange, we can see how radishes and bumblebees, the ones that we were preventing their interaction, reduce their persistence probability, while the other four species tend to increase slightly the persistence probability. One of the coolest results I think we found is that this reconfiguration is due to making this experiment empirical and seeing the reorganization of the interaction strength. Because if we compare that with a network where we remove this link synthetically, that is, we just in our computer said, okay, the link between radish and bumblebees, we'll set it to 0, and we recalculate everything. We see almost no changes in persistence. And you can see the red dots are very aligned with the blue dots. So why the empirical situation differs? This is because the rest of the links were affected. So when we prevented the bumblebee radish link, so we reduced this link strength by 100%, that was empirically forced. We just prevented this interaction by physically putting a net across the radish. I think I missed to say that, sorry. We can see that the bumblebees increase their visits to field bean, for example. And we can see also that the mason bees have some release of competition in radish and start visiting more the radish, the same as the green butterflies. So this rewiring or reorganization of interaction strength is important. And in fact, we can see how the effects of the synthetically removed, here the relative change of the red points is almost always very small, but the effects of the physically prevented link, the empirical data that we get are always higher. So that's also a caution note that in silico experiments, things that we manipulate in the network structure within our computers need to take into account this potential reorganization of the network. Once you touch one link, it will cascade through the others. So I think with that, we were really, really happy that we can have a framework to analyze the full plant-pollinator networks, including not only the mutualistic effects, but the competition between the trophic guilds. And we are now even more happy because we just got accepted this paper, and I got the proof yesterday. So if we are curious on that, it will be published earlier, probably next week or the week before in PNAS. Okay, so what next? Pollinators are important, but probably you have a preferred study system, and you will say, oh, sure, but we have predators that are super important in changing pollinator behavior. Or you may say, oh, but I know the systems and herbivores like snails or grasshoppers are super important in affecting plant fitness. Can we take that into account? The good news is that this kind of framework, it doesn't matter how many types of interactions you have, if you can measure the interaction strength. So we can put as much layers as we want within the same framework. In fact, this interaction matrix that we were describing, we are planning to bring it to the field and going back to Caracoles ranch, where we can measure the plant-plant competition. Here is the alpha P, the competition between herbivores, and the competition between floral visitors in this alpha FV. And we can also take into account the interactions, either positive or negative, between herbivores and plants, or the benefit of plants on herbivores, and the same with the floral visitors. So if we can estimate these values, which is not a trivial task, and we are on it, we can run the same kind of structural stability models to see which of the different parcels of this community are driving the stability of the full community. And again, David Garcia Callejas is leading that research, and we are already building these networks of multi-trophic interactions, taking into account plants, herbivores, and well, initially we're considering predators, but I think for now we are going to stick with pollinators, plants, and herbivores. So we have these 9 plots, well characterized, and the next step is trying to parameterize the models. So by going a step back and trying to understand the stability of the, like what drives the stability of the system, what drives the coexistence of the species, we can use this, we can put together these pieces and see how they interact together, and hopefully understand better why they are functioning as they are. So once the pieces are assembled, we can understand better why they are persistent. How can we relate that to the earlier question on how can we better understand or anticipate to global change drivers? So if we understand the basic theoretical structure of why species, why communities can persist, we can start asking questions like how different effects will ramify through this network of interactions, and how this will change the probability of persistence of different species. For example, land use change or habitat destruction. What happens if we reduce part of the habitat? What happens if we lose part of the species due to habitat degradation? Can we use these tools to see how the combination of the interactions will change the community structure? Or for example, we can also ask how adding a new species, for example, exotic species that are introduced by humans, entering a community, how this will restructure the network of interactions and hence the probability of persistence of these species. Or for instance, what happens if we increase the abundance of one of the species on the community artificially, like for example with honeybees, which are kept by beekeepers in high densities. So how these high densities are affecting the rest of the community. This is the kind of questions that we can ask in the future when we understand better this framework. I'm not saying we are yet ready to tackle these questions, at least with any predictive power, but at least I think going back to the mechanisms is the first step to be able to tackle these questions from a more solid context. Another final example is pathogens, how the prevalence of pathogens may change that. Again, if we can measure the effects of this pathogen, how change the abundance of these focal species, how this change the competitive interactions with the other species, this can help us understand the effects at the community scale, which are usually elusive. And this was more or less what I wanted to talk about today. I know it's a bit more conceptually hard, especially if you are not familiar with the structural stability framework, but I hope that was engaging enough and it was stimulating to read more about this kind of framework, which I think could be very useful. And of course, that wouldn't be possible without the Radical Community Ecology group, which integrates my lab and Oscar Godoy's lab and the funding agencies. And thank you very much.
Thank you, Nacho. Thank you so much for your talk. It was very, very intensive and very exciting as well. So we have a bunch of questions in the chat, and please, if you have more questions, write your questions in the chat, and I will ask Nacho. So Montse Vila is asking, well, she has 2 questions. She says, great to know that simulating removals do not offer the same results than empirical removals. So do you think that extinction models underestimate cascading effects? And then she asks again, if do you think that you will get similar results if instead of putting plants to compete, the competitors will be the pollinators?
Sure, those are super interesting questions. So the first question, I think.
So the first question, do you
Yeah,
remember?
yeah,
No?
yeah. No, I think even theoretical ecologists acknowledge that this removal of a species in silico is a good proxy of how robust is overall the system, but it has no sense to ask out the specific changes or extinctions because we know that there are other processes going on. So I think if possible, we can get this data from empirical simulations, but we can also try to do better on this potential preconfiguration of the network, which is also a topic that there's making quite a lot of progress on how we can understand how these interactions recalibrate once there is one change. But yeah, I agree that if we want to go deeper into the responses, we need to use empirical data sets. And the second question, indeed, we put the pollinators to compete. Logistically, it's way more difficult because plants are really easy to work with, I have to say. But we put for example, the osmias and the bumblebees in the same cage, and we can compare their reproduction success when they are alone and when they are together, and we can then see if when they are together we see a reduction in their reproductive success, we assume this is due to the competition. So it's possible, and some systems are easier to work than with others, but it's totally doable.
Okay, thank you. So there are more questions. Wow, there are many questions. So now August, he's asking you, a very cool talk, Nacho. I'm curious to know how climatic variables may relate to coexistence in your theoretical model. Would they be related to the feasibility axis in some way?
Yeah, totally. So so those are constructs that you can model whatever you have data for. So as in the first example I was showing, we were adding environmental variables. In our case, we were adding salinity because it's what we think it's important in our case. But if the climatic variables are important for your species, you can see how these variables are affecting both the reproductive success and the competitive interactions. And of course, the more things you model, the more complex it gets. But the framework it's taking into account any biotic and abiotic variables that you want to model.
Yeah, I think in one of your slides you have the equations with the environmental variables, right?
Yeah.
If you want to, I want to put that slide. So there is another question from Paco Rodriguez Sanchez. So very cool, experimental demonstration and analysis of rewiring. Congrats. One question, these coexistence models are quite complex with many parameters. How data hungry are they? How feasible to gather all the data that we need to properly estimate all these parameters?
That's the key question. So so yeah, they are data hungry, and as you see in the experimental in the experiment we have a 6 species community, very simple, and measuring all the parameters is a nightmare. So I think we need to work in parallel also in trying to make simpler models. And there are different ways of looking at that. We are working on, for example, working at the functional group level and seeing if we can assume, for example, that the competitive effects are similar within functional group and across functional groups. So that simplifies a lot the estimation. We can also use some heuristics in terms of which links are gonna be never observed. For example, species that do not occur at the same timing, so the phenology is different, we can assume these links are going to 0, and we don't need to estimate those links, and then try to get a set of key links to estimate. And this is an ongoing debate, and I think multiple approaches are needed, more mechanistic, data-hungry models, but also more heuristic, simple models that can complement without less, that are less data demanding. I think both can coexist.
Okay, thank you. So there are more questions. So Cayetano Gutierrez Cánovas, he's saying, in the questions you showed, the number of occurring plants was assumed to have only negative effects through competition. However, there is evidence linking higher plant yield richness with increased facilitation and overall biomass production, among other functions. How do you think this may affect to your study's outcomes? Many thanks, and congratulations for the very cool presentation.
Again, I'm super happy with these questions because they are nailing the key weaknesses of the process we've been following, and also some of them we already fixed them. So it's nice to see that that line of thought. So the Chesson framework, at least in their more widely applied equations, assume competition, and they do not work, at least for calculating coexistence across the species when we have a lot of facilitation. But we get completely away from that framework when we move to the structural stability, where the interactions can get any sign. So plants can have facilitative effects, and indeed, we found I think the relationship between field bean and tomato is positive in some of our treatments, and we just treat it as such. So field bean is facilitating tomato. So we are taking into account these positive and negative effects.
Yeah, everybody's congratulations to you. Monse saying, thank you so much, very inspiring talk, many ideas for future studies. And Alisa Sitwell, sorry if I didn't pronounce well, she says, cool talk and super impressive demonstration of changing interaction frequencies in the field. But some of the pollinators, green butterflies, don't seem to have done many visits. 100% increase, but plus 1 visit. Do you think that this severely impacts your results?
Yeah, so that's again a good point. I think in the paper we do not put a lot of emphasis on that because honestly, that's something I regret having better data on. So the number of the visitation rates of the different plants, but we were doing a ton of things simultaneously. So we measure in a couple of occasions the number of visits that we were counting, but we don't have a huge sample size for that. So the numbers are relative also to the sampling effort. So I wouldn't trust specifically the exact rewiring numbers that we are observing in this subsample. But I think the most important point, and something that is very robust and very general, is that if you prevent one link, the rest of the species will behave differently and they will restructure. And this is something we've been seeing in with better data in observational studies. For example, when we see honeybee densities increase artificially by adding more colonies, we've observed like the native bees rewire the interactions and stop visiting the preferred plants by the honeybees and start visiting less preferred plants. So this kind of rewiring patterns, I think it's quite common in nature, and regardless of how well or how easy are to estimate, I think we should take them into account.
Nats, I have a question of the logistics of the experiment. How did you physically prevent the interaction between the bumblebee and the Raphanus?
Yeah, that's something I noticed. I didn't put a slide on this, but that was brute force approach. We basically put a mesh On the Raphanus, it's I think it's a 1 centimeter mesh size, where the bumblebees are not able to enter, but the smaller bees and
Okay.
flies are able to enter. And of course, this may have some side effects, but I think it did the trick to at least have a nice picture of what could happen if we change the interaction structure.
Yeah. So you had so many treatments that the sample size per treatment was relatively low, no? Because you had many treatments, no?
Yeah, for the plants, that's also why we presented first the plants. For the plants, the sample size, and that's being really, really strong because we can replicate it way easier. For the pollinators, at the end, we had the reproduction success of the pollinators in all the combinations, but the replication there was very low.
Mm-hmm. I see. Yeah, it's very hard to make an experiment like this. There are more questions. So Joanna Robbins King, she says, fantastic talk. I wonder if there is a way of factoring in a temporal aspect. So how temporal separation and phenology could facilitate coexistence in terms of sharing pollinators. For instance, that the flight season of a pollinator spans the sequential flowering period of two potential competing plants. Currently working on this, but finding it a tricky thing to capture.
Yeah, so it's a very interesting phenomenon, and I'm sure it's happening in nature. And for now, what we are doing is we are assuming that we can capture the signature of this phenology on the interaction coefficients. So if two species are phenologically not overlapping, we will also retrieve an interaction coefficient, like for example, the competition between these two species will be close to 0. And as we pull all the season together, we assume that we can capture some of these phenomenons in a, like it's a bit redundant, in a phenomenological way. So we don't explicitly take into account these time effects, but the models should recover those in terms of interaction strengths. And of course, opening the Pandora box and looking within year what's happening, that would be super interesting, but way beyond what we are doing right now.
Yeah, that was also my point about the temporal evolution of the interactions. So yeah, very, very good question. And there is another question. So Cayetano is saying, thank you. Okay, thank you. And Ruben Bernardo, he is asking, how could you differentiate whether species have their lambda outside the domain because the system is unstable or because some domain expanding factor is missing?
Well, I guess so I guess you need to rely on the on your estimation of parameters. So if you trust your interaction strength that you measure, you should trust also the response and then when these lambdas are outside of the feasibility domain, and you trust the estimates that created that, it's probably because of an ecological effect. But of course, I take it as a honest critique on it's really hard to measure this interaction strength. And of course, if you estimate those, you may get misleading results. That said, I think because we're playing quite a lot with these models, and small perturbations to the matrices are not changing much the results. So small miscalculations of the strength are not going to make a huge difference. But of course, if you are missing, let's say, one species or one interaction that is positive, and you are putting them as negative or things like that, of course, you carry over this error.
Thank you. So Ruben is saying, impressive line of research, congratulations. And also Joanna Rubinstein, she says, thank you so much, really interesting. And I don't know if there are more questions in the chat. I mean, if you still want to ask more, we have a few minutes if you want. I also wanted to ask you about so forecasting. I mean, how can we use these models to, because you are doing a very simple community, with only 3 plants, the 3 pollinators, are far away from them. I mean, even in the Arctic, you have more complex communities.
Yes.
And how can we use this for forecasting changes in community stability with from super sample that you took a lot of time and effort to get the data for estimating the parameters to, I mean, more realistic communities?
Yeah, no, again, that's a big question. And when I was talking about forecasting, I was just using as a storytelling or where I think we should go. And this is one of the paths to increase our predictive ability, is to understand better the mechanisms of what makes communities stable. But we are really far from getting an accurate prediction of what will happen in nature. I have to say, even with the very well parameterized community, it's really hard to forecast properly the abundances, because there are many non-model parameters out there. So I think for now we can use that to understand better which factors are important and which we have to take into account. But I wouldn't use that framework yet for any real forecasting.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much. So I think there are no more questions. But so the last second, if you want to ask something. But thank you so much, Nacho. Was super cool, super interesting line of research. I think you are gonna do this for the next years, no? Here at the EBD is your forthcoming.
Most likely.
Yeah.
As I said, I think we are just at the beginning of understanding this kind of complex multi-trophic processes, and there are a lot of unknowns yet to solve.
Yeah, but I think you're gonna have a lot of success also going this
Thank
way.
you.
And so thank you so much, everybody, for being there, for listening to the talk, and we will wait for you for the next week. We will have another seminar by Maria Jose Navarro. So thank you so much.